Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea is facing an intense period of political transition following the impeachment of former President Yoon Suk-yeol. As Seoul prepares for new leadership, attention has been shifted to North Korea's muted response to Yoon's dismissal, as it stands in stark contrast to its past behaviors, raising questions about Pyongyang's current strategic thinking. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un's high-profile military inspection on the day of the ruling, along with renewed statements from Kim Yo-jong and a reported border crossing incident in the DMZ, suggests that tensions may still be simmering beneath the surface. To delve deeper into the inter-Korean situation, we invite our go-to North Korea expert, Dr. Kim Mok-yeon, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy, here in the studio with us. Welcome.
Nice to be back.
And also joining us is Brian Myers, Professor of International Studies at Dongsa University. Great to have you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start our discussion with Dr. Go. North Korea has briefly reported on the news of former President Yoon Suk-yeol's dismissal without making any special comments, which was a day after it happened. Now, this is in contrast to its past behavior of having a swift and detailed reporting of former President Park Geun-hye's impeachment. How should we read into this?
I think it's an extension of North Korea's stance towards South Korea, which was one of indifference rather than antagonism. So if you remember, the relationship between former President Park Geun-hye and Kim Jong-un at the time was very antagonistic. There's ongoing criticism between the two sides almost on a daily basis. There's a high tension, and then there's also friction due to the intermittent attempts at restarting inter-Korean dialogue, which from the North Korean view was rebuffed by the then President Park Geun-hye. Whereas with President Yoon Suk-yeol, the relationship seems to be one of indifference. North Korea has formulated the so-called the two hostile states principle. So they view South Korea as an enemy state now. And then and in North Korea, in fact, stop engaging South Korea either in dialogue or in provocations. So it's been quite calm, but then at the same time, obviously there are episodes of the trash balloons coming to the south, but we all know that South Korea also was engaging in essentially information campaign against North Korea using the loudspeakers, for instance. So there's some friction, but then the friction and the tension was manageable. And then overall, the tone of the relationship was one of indifference. So I think this is extending to their reaction to President Yoon's impeachment. But having said that, they also could be that the North Koreans are trying to figure out how to somehow communicate this issue to the domestic public, domestic audience. I think it's difficult for the North Koreans to explain that a leader of a country was all-powerful until just a couple of months ago. It now has been impeached and lost all status, and probably will face justice sooner rather than later. So I think this is a difficult story that North Korean can formulate to their own audience. So probably could be another reason why the regime is taking time to communicate this through their media.
Right, so largely indifferent stance, but it could be taking into consideration the impact on domestic affairs. What about you, Professor Myers? Do you agree, there's views that North Korea may have limited its rhetoric against the South because this impeachment news could negatively impact its own regime? What are your thoughts?
They're a little bit different. Generally speaking, North Koreans don't think of their leader as being even remotely comparable to South Korean leaders. They may be dissatisfied with their lives, even to the point of wanting to run away, but they tend not to blame their problems on the leader. As far as they're concerned, the political strife down here, things like impeachments, are not a sign of freedom, they're a sign of bad leadership. It's what happens when countries don't have a unifying leader like Kim Jong-un. Now, that may seem ridiculous to us, but there you go. As for why they're not talking about this so much in their news, I think, as Dr. Go said, that's because, in large part, because Kim said last year that he regards South Korea as a foreign country, that he doesn't trust even the left wing here. Now, I don't think he means that, but he wants the outside world to think he does. So the state media has to show a certain indifference to South Korean politics. But just because the central news agency isn't talking a lot about this does not necessarily mean that citizens aren't hearing about it in some detail in their farms and factories. That kind of local party propaganda tends to be a better indication of the regime's attitude. But the problem is we just don't know very much about that kind of stuff now that the border is so much harder to get across. We're not getting the kind of defector testimony that we used to get.
Right. Now, so on the other hand, there's also a view that the North may have limited its rhetoric against South Korea as the impeachment news could negatively, excuse me, I'll move on to the next question. So the North's KCNA has reported that Kim Jong-un has inspected a special operations unit on April 4th, which was the same day that President Yoon impeachment ruling was held. Do you think this holds any significance?
No, I think it's a byproduct of the fact that the North Korean media is trying to avoid covering the impeachment in South Korea. It's the overall tone of indifference. I think if we check the programming right now in North Korea, I'm sure there's tons of coverage on the military aspects of military development taking place in the country, because that's where the regime is focused on right now. And it just happens that every 4th they prepare some sort of programming that showcases their special forces and alongside with Kim Jong-un. But having said that, I think the North Koreans probably enjoys the juxtaposition between the relative political chaos in South Korea, whereas in the North, their leader can show that he's in charge, he's in control, and also the appearing alongside the Special Forces unit, he can project the image that he has the initiative in the Korean Peninsula, unlike the South. South is in a disarray, there's a leadership vacuum, whereas in the North, Kim Jong-un is firmly in power. So I think this is a message, maybe it wasn't intended by the North Korean media, but nonetheless, this kind of interpretation is probably what the North Korean would like to see in the international community, especially in the South.
Right, so the timing actually raises questions about the regime's intention. Now, we all know that former President Yoon Suk-yeol's administration had been maintaining a hardline stance regarding North Korea. Dr. Go, do you believe that a shift in terms of policies on North Korea could be necessary under the next administration?
Well, I think what's more important for South Korea is to put the house in order, but especially when it comes to its coordination with the allies and partners. So the biggest challenge right now is not so much North Korea, but the United States. And the reason is because North Korea is trying to restart a dialogue with Washington, and for them, for the North Koreans, I mean, the South Korea is not a priority either. So in that sense, it's important for South Korea to be in the lockstep with the United States, which is a much more challenging task than before, because President Trump doesn't want to be tied to the agendas formulated by the allies. So in that sense, I think it's going to be much more of a challenge than before. But nonetheless, it's important for South Korea and the United States to be on the same page when it comes to the North Korean issues. And we know that the North Korea's strategy is always about, it's always really about driving the wedge between Seoul and Washington. So I think the North Koreans are sensing that there's a gap between Washington and Seoul. And I think it's only going to grow over time because of President Trump's own unpredictable behavior on many issues, because he believes, President Trump believes that the unpredictability increases the leverage, not only vis-a-vis the adversaries of the United States, but also with the allies. So in that sense, I think South Korea's priority is not North Korea right now, it's Washington.
Right, so we have to focus on dialogue with the Trump administration. Now, there's also sayings that the dialogue between North Korea and the U.S. is being cited as the biggest variable that could shake the situation in the Korean Peninsula. Now, in this context, Kim Yo-jong, Vice Department Director of the Workers' Party and Kim's sister, of course, strongly objected to the foreign ministers' meeting between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, where they affirmed commitments to North Korea's denuclearization. And she said it's the most hostile act. Now, Professor Myers, what do you think is the significance of Kim Yo-jong stepping forward to reiterate North Korea's position?
Well, I get the impression that often she plays the part of the bad cop. If you know the expression bad cop, good cop, she's often the person who makes the more hardline, more fiery statements, while Kim Jong-un preserves a certain distance. So I wouldn't necessarily ascribe too much importance to what she says. I would tend to read more importance into the fact that Kim Jong-un is not saying these things. I think Kim Jong-un is trying to position himself to be ready to accept a negotiation offer from Donald Trump when that time comes.
Right. So it's really interesting to see Kim stepping forward again, but there's still openness for Kim Jong-un and Trump to proceed on their dialogue. Now, South Korea, as for South Korea, acting President Han Duck-soo and U.S. President Trump held their first phone call for nearly 30 minutes on Tuesday. And this was the first conversation between the two leaders since the Trump second administration. Dr. Go, amid continued concerns over this so-called Korea passing in the nuclear negotiations, of course, how do you assess this latest dialogue between the two leaders?
So it's never too late. So it's good that the acting president Han Duck-soo and the President Trump have finally had a chance to speak to each other. At the same time, I don't think South Korea is, I mean, the United States, can afford to bypass South Korea in any of the important issues that are outstanding right now, not just in the region, but also in the rest of the world, because South Korea is it's an important, very significant power, so to speak. It doesn't really exercise that power that much, but it's very influential nonetheless. So in that sense, I think it wasn't really the South Koreans, because there's anxiety on the part of the South Korean leadership that there was no close communication between the leaders of the two countries. But I think the anxiety is probably in Washington as well. Maybe not with President Trump himself, but I'm for sure that the national security team in the White House right now had this anxiety about not being able to have a conversation with the South Korean leadership, because there are many outstanding issues that require South Korea's attention, not just the American attention. So in that sense, I think it was actually I think that the American government has been waiting for this moment, that there will be clarity in terms of the leadership situation in South Korea. Now that the political agenda for the next 2 months until the election in June 3rd is actually very clear, I think that the White House probably felt that this was the moment for them to finally have that conversation with the acting leadership in South Korea. And I think President Trump has essentially mentioned all the priority items here. So burden sharing issue, the tariff issue, and he essentially gave a very important hint here, which is he's going to connect the two issues, which was very much reflected concerns on the part of Seoul, because there's a fear that President Trump would do so. They're linking the two issues, the defense as well as with the trade, and he said he will do so. So in that sense, it's been an important, eye-opening opportunity for South Korea to plan ahead, create a roadmap for a dialogue with President Trump, regardless of who gets elected in June 3rd.
Right, so it's clearly a good sign that the two sides have begun negotiations. Now, Dr. Go has mentioned that the two sides will be able to discuss defense cost sharing, and this would be a crucial topic for South Korea, of course. Professor Myers, what kind of proactive diplomatic and security responses should South Korea move on to going forward?
Well, I don't think it can do very much right now. I don't think an acting president can have that much of an effect on Donald Trump's thinking, because, for one thing, Trump is America first, and he feels that South Korea's security is primarily the South Koreans' responsibility. That's a big difference, I think. Remember, Donald Trump has indicated a certain readiness even to pull out of NATO. And I think South Koreans should be aware that if an American president is ready to say that about Europe, a continent with which America has much deeper cultural and traditional ties, then of course South Koreans should prepare for the possibility that Donald Trump might be seriously considering at least taking a number of American troops out of the country. So I think South Koreans are going to need to have that kind of urgency when they're talking to Trump, the kind of confidence that South Koreans had during the Moon Jae-in administration that America would never leave South Korea. I think they're going to have to move on from that. I think that if the acting president, Han Duck-soo, wants to get America's attention in the next 2 months, he might do better to raise the issue of China with Washington and not so much the issue of North Korea, because I think the Americans are less likely than they were before to regard North Korea as a really big threat. I think Trump is confident that he can talk to Kim Jong-un and reach a deal later on. But the Americans are worried about Chinese expansion, I think.
Right, so proactive engagement and clear signaling would be even more important than ever. Now, Dr. Go, North Korea and Russia, they have been strengthening their relations into a strategic alliance, and the U.S.-Russia relationship is reportedly improving in light of this Ukraine ceasefire talks. So amid these challenges in the international landscape, how do you think South Korea should move forward with its diplomacy for the sake of the peninsula stability?
So clearly the foreign policy landscape today is very different from what we've been used to in the last, I would say, 30 years since the end of the Cold War, mainly because the United States essentially it's not switching sides. So I actually take issues with the characterization that Russia and the U.S. relations improving just because they are talking to each other. But nonetheless, I think clearly United States are rethinking about its relationship with the allies in particular. So I think this is clearly a challenge, a novel challenge for South Korea, which has been so accustomed to having a very benevolent ally in the form of the United States until last year. So in that sense, it comes as a shock. But I think there are major trends and small trends and then we have to make sure that we get the major questions right here. And I think the big question is, I completely agree with Professor Myers that the big question is not North Korea. In Seoul, we tend to be very myopic and then develop this tunnel vision that everything is about North Korea or the Korean Peninsula. That's not the case at all. I think the big question is going to be China, as well as the rift that's taking place between the two traditional transatlantic sides, the United States and Europe. So this is going to have a major impact in the international relations in the foreseeable future. And we have to get that question right. We have to ensure that we have to understand the President Trump's motivations here rather than preoccupying too much about getting bypassed by Washington and by President Trump because we are concerned that we could be abandoned by the United States. So we have to understand this fear that we have. That could be, I think a lot of our partners and allies don't quite agree with this fear that we have about getting abandoned by the United States, especially in 2025, when South Korea is much more influential actor in the global landscape. So I think, so in that sense, I think we should signal to Washington that we are with the United States when it comes to China. And even though we understand the tension and friction between Europe and the United States, South Korea, even though we're a good ally of the United States, we will always remain an ally of the United States. At the same time, we are committed to the universal values and norms that the Western countries always share with some other countries outside of the Western bloc, such as Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand. So in that sense, I think we have to be very clear that when it comes to the big questions that the international community faces today, we have the right answers for all the important players.
Right. So stressing alliance with with Washington would also be helpful. Now let's also touch upon a more recent incident, Dr. Go. The Joint Chiefs of Staff reported that around a dozen North Korean soldiers crossed the DMZ in the eastern section of DMZ, and it may have been a simple happening. Some also are concerned that it could have some meaning to this. How do you view this?
So this is one of the typical behaviors that it's not just North Korea that displays this kind of behavior, so it's China and Russia. So it's more about what's more important here. So it's really not what North Koreans have done, which is trespassing the military demarcation line that divides the demilitarized zone into two sections. It's really our reaction, because what the North Koreans are trying to find out from here is how will we respond? Are we shaken? Are we like, is this creating some sort of a controversy in South Korea? It's like a friction within the country about how to deal with North Korea from now on. So they are probing our readiness. That's how I would put it. So really the focus should be less about North Korea. We don't know what kind of intentions North Korea had by engaging this kind of behavior, but then we know what kind of reaction they would like to see from us, which is a disarray on the part of South Korea. So as long as we have a clear understanding of their motivation, we don't know too shaken by this kind of action by North Korea, I think we'll be fine.
So we would just stay calm and, right.
And come and move on. That's right.
All right.
Yeah.
That will wrap up our program for tonight. Thank you so much for your insights and your time, Dr. Go.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And Professor Myers. We appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure too.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.